Hello there, YouTube. I want to talk about a figure in literature who I think is getting an easy ride and, frankly, shouldn't be allowed to be even considered a literary figure. A figure that we should discount completely as someone who never wrote any literature and is not an author. And that person is William Shakespeare. You see, one of the things that bugs me a little is that if you look up the British curriculum for literature classes, it is jam-packed with Shakespeare. When I went to school, we studied Shakespeare repeatedly. I read more Shakespeare plays than I did everything else combined. Now, think about that for a minute. I read Shakespeare plays. Why? Why was I reading plays in my literature class? They didn't make me watch films in the literature class. I wasn't playing video games in the literature class. I wasn't listening to music in the literature class. We have a music class where we studied music. We also had a drama class where we should have studied drama, plays, and performances, stage performances. That's what that class was supposed to be. What it actually was some barely qualified weirdo making us pretend to be trees in a completely blackened room. There was no real teaching happening in the drama classes in my school. It was all new age hippie bullshit, basically. We didn't learn any actual acting skill. We didn't learn any psychology, any attempts to teach people stage presence or to control nerves. We put on no performances that I know of. Generally speaking, schools put on plays and performances. They will have a drama club or something along those lines that will put on a performance. Now, not in my school. I don't remember a single performance. Not one. So, we had a drama department. It had its own room, its own staged room, that was far bigger than some other departments, and yet it seemingly taught nothing of value. Why, when plays and stage performances is a massive part of British history, and you have Shakespeare? Theatre should be a study of its own. Right? The class called drama, first of all, that is the wrong name for it. It should be theatre studies. Because that's what we're actually studying. Right? Drama is a genre. It's not an area of study, it's a genre. Having a drama class is like the equivalent of having a fantasy class. And frankly, if we're going to do that, I expect a fantasy class, I expect a horror class, and I expect a sci-fi class, because I would have enjoyed them a fuckload more. But Shakespeare isn't literature. So why do we learn it in literature? Why do we spend time reading Shakespeare, writing essays about the meaning and the word use in Shakespeare, spending all this time analysing the text and rereading and reading over and over different parts? Often you'd study Shakespeare in our schools by reading an excerpt from a play. You wouldn't read the whole play. You'd just read like 2 scenes. And you'd read them over and over again until you knew them by fucking heart. But you didn't know any of the context. You hadn't watched any performances. You hadn't read the previous scenes. You hadn't read the scenes following. Unless you went out of your way to read it in your spare time. You didn't know how the play started or how the play ended. So, what does this mean? What it means is, you're expecting kids, ages like 13 to 16, to read an out-of-context transcript of a play, and from that understand literature. That is bizarre and makes no sense at all. That would be like me deciding to take a scene from a film, get a transcript of that scene, get the script and the directions from the stage play, and have kids read that and then say that they're studying literature. It doesn't matter what anyone says. If I was to take a scene from a Quentin Tarantino film and go, there you go, read that, and just give them the transcript of a scene from a film without the visual elements, how would you know what that means? Would that make any sense to you at all? See, the worst part is I actually remember doing this. They actually did this in school. They didn't use a Quentin Tarantino film, they used The Matrix. I actually studied The Matrix in school. And I remember doing it. I didn't take film studies. I distinctly remember studying one of the scenes. It was specifically the scene where Neo is waiting under a bridge, gets in a car, and has the worm thing implanted in his stomach. It was that scene. And we watched the scene they wheeled in a TV. They wheeled in one of those old CRT TVs with VHS, and we watched that scene and only that scene multiple times. We analysed the scene. We had a transcript of that scene, so that we could go over every line of dialogue and directions for the actors, and we analysed it quite in depth. For what purpose? There was no real intent to teach us anything about film, but this was taught, I'm sure this was taught, in a literature class, as some kind of comparative new media study that we're doing. I'm not sure why they decided to do it there when we had a media studies department, and I didn't opt to take media studies. Instead, media studies, which I did for the first 3 years in high school, because you have to do a variety of classes in the UK, then you choose which classes to continue on to GCSE. When I did media studies, the only thing we studied was advertising. How to build billboards, how to write slogans, what kind of colours cause us to think in certain ways. It was an interesting class. But we never studied anything outside of advertising. That was the only thing we ever studied. Everything from television advertising to billboards. We covered the entire lot. And I suppose, in many ways, that's probably the most effective class that you could do in media studies, because that's probably the best way of getting a job in that field of study. What I'm saying, though, is that Shakespeare isn't an author. He didn't write books. It's not literature. When I give a list of the books that I think people should be reading, Shakespeare is never on it. I do not recommend reading any Shakespeare. You should not read Shakespeare. That is going to be the title of this video. You should not read Shakespeare. Because you shouldn't. You should watch Shakespeare. You should go to a theatre, or if you don't have the ability to do that, watch a televised theatre production of Shakespeare. And I do mean a theatre production, not a TV adaptation, because the theatre is not the same as the television. There was the confines of the theatre. The scenes are written differently because Shakespeare wrote it knowing that he had the confines of a stage. Everything he had to do had to fit on one stage. He couldn't have different camera angles, he couldn't change the viewing perspective, he couldn't have a lingering shot, he couldn't cut backwards and forwards. TV and film have way, way more freedom in what they can do with perspective. Whereas all he had was a single stage, a few props, and occasionally a backdrop setting which could be switched out, depending on where you were performing and what kind of stage you were on. Which means that watching a theatre production of a Shakespearean play is the way it was intended. And that is what we should be studying. That's not literature. And it shouldn't be considered literature in any way. In the same way that we do not consider anything else to be literature. We don't consider film to be literature. We don't consider music to be literature. We don't consider opera to be literature. Right? Performances and other forms of media should be considered for what they are. Shakespeare should never be in literature class. You should not read Shakespeare. And I think that's a message that we need to be pushing in schools as much as we can. Because the one thing that ruins reading for so many kids is forcing them to read endless bloody Shakespeare. So, on that, I'll see you next time. Lazy YouTube.